In this position, it's black to play, and they play the move e5, which attacks white's knight. And at first glance, this looks like a good move. Actually, it is a good move, but there's one drawback to this move. The drawback is that as soon as you move the pawn forward, you lose control of these two squares. This is something really, really important in chess. Pawns cannot move backwards. So when they move forward, they permanently give up control of certain squares of the board. And since black doesn't have a pawn over here on c6 to control this either, the d5 square becomes a critical weakness. And over the course of the game, white is going to use that square as a landing spot for their pieces and ultimately get into a really nice position. This is something that I really want you to think about. That's why I chose to highlight this moment in the game. We're going to look at this entire game, see how we ended up here, and how the game finished. You're going to learn a lot, and this is the final episode in the series where we're going through this book, Logical Chess Move by Move. It's game number 33. We've been doing this video a week for the last 33 weeks. You guys have voted on what book we're going to do next, which I will share with you at the end of the video, so make sure you stick around for that. You guys filled out a poll. I have the results that I'll share with you. But having said that, let's go ahead and jump right in to this final game. All right, so we have d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, and now we kind of transpose into a queen's gambit. Black declines the gambit. Bishop g5 pins the knight, puts pressure on these center squares, and black immediately breaks the pin with bishop to e7. So far, so good. Everybody's developing their pieces. Nothing really to worry about. e3, knight to d7. This brings us to our first key point, which is in these d4, d5 openings, usually you don't want to block your c-pawn with your knight because pushing that c-pawn forward is a great way to put pressure on the center and open up the c-file if you need to, which is a lot of times a good place for your rooks to go. Okay, so black wisely goes here instead of going to c6. This is a mistake that a lot of beginners make. Sometimes you can get away with it if you're able to play a quick e5 and get counterplay in other areas of the board. But if for some reason that gets shut down, you're going to be in trouble. And that's why, generally speaking, in the d4, d5 openings, you're going to see the knight go to d7, followed by, at some point, the pawn going to c5. So white plays knight c3, developing the piece. Black castles, gets the king to safety. Rook to c1. This brings us to another key point that I kind of already touched on, but the c-file is usually very, very important in these queen-pawn openings. And so white is immediately putting that rook there where they know it's going to be valuable at some point later on during the game. So black plays rook e8, which a lot of times is a useful move because in a lot of cases the e-file will get open at some point. If you imagine if white captures and black recaptures, this could be a useful square for the rook. Also, sometimes this knight can actually go back to f8. There's a saying in chess, with a knight on f8, there is no mate. It actually does a great job of defending h7. You can jump to g6 if you need to, and it kind of just keeps the king nice and safe. So rook e8 is one of those typical moves that you'll see. Queen to c2, adding more support on the c-file, also gaining control of this important diagonal. And black captures here. I think if I was playing this position as black, I would not capture at this moment. I would try to wait for white to move their bishop and then capture, because then you're going to make them move their bishop 2 times, and you essentially make them waste a move. By taking now, you knew they wanted to develop their bishop next, at least most likely, and so they don't have to waste any time. And this was kind of a clever thing that white did, going back to when they played rook c1 and queen c2. They did those developing moves first, waited on the bishop, kind of hoping that black might take the pawn, which black did. A lot of people will play bishop d3 immediately, instead of doing the rook or the queen, but then they have to end up wasting 2 moves, or wasting 1 move, I should say. So back to the game. White's pretty happy they recaptured the pawn. Now black does play c5, key move that we kind of talked about, putting pressure on the center. White gets the king to safety, and black trades. Now we have an interesting moment in the game. Which way would you take this pawn? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, hopefully you didn't think too long on this one, because there's no wrong answer here. And actually, both of these moves are good for white for different reasons. So in the game, Rubinstein decides to take with the knight. And the reason he wanted to do that was because he didn't want to have the weakness of the isolated pawn. And isolated pawns are weak for a couple of reasons. Number one, they can be targets themselves because they have no pawns that can support them. Okay. The other thing that a lot of people don't always think about is the square right in front of the pawn is also a weakness because there's no pawns from the side that could push up and kind of support that as well. So you kind of have double weaknesses when you have an isolated pawn like that. And so that's what Rubinstein was trying to avoid. That being said, it's not all bad news to do this because this pawn is actually a critical pawn in controlling some key squares here where black's knight might want to jump to, or the bishop might want to jump to. If they ever want to play e5, you're going to be ready to take it. So there's a lot of good things about the pawn being on d4 as well. So it's kind of a trade-off of like, would you rather have the control over these squares at the cost of a potential weakness in the future at some point? Or would you rather, like Rubinstein decided in this game, keep your pawns looking nice and connected, but then you don't get control over these squares, right? So he goes for this one. It's more of a matter of personal preference rather than one is right and one is wrong. So black plays a6 to keep some of these pieces from having the option to jump to b5 because there was a lot of potential ideas there. And now white plays rook f to d1. So this is, I want to pause here and just point something out that he mentions in the book. He says this is a really good example of how white has developed perfectly. And when I say perfectly, what I mean is every single move was developing a piece to its best square as quickly as possible. They didn't waste any time. They, got the pawns in the center. The knight went to f3. The bishop went to g5. This knight went to c3. The rook came here. The queen came here. The rook came here. The bishop came here. This knight recaptured. Every single move had a purpose, had a plan to get his pieces on the ideal squares as quickly as possible. You see a lot of beginner games where they move one bishop like 3 different times, or maybe they make a bunch of pawn moves early in the game. They're not developing their pieces as quickly as possible. This is how strong players play. All right, so black plays queen a5, and what is the threat behind this move? Well, that was an easy one. Hopefully you noticed the bishop on g5 is undefended now because the knight has moved away, and so white simply retreats the bishop to save it. Knight to e5, again, is attacking the bishop, and he simply retreats the bishop to save it. Now, this is an important point I want to make here. When someone's knight attacks your bishop and you have to move somewhere, a lot of times it's nice to go back to a square that is what we call dominating the knight. And what that means is anywhere that the knight would like to move forward, let me do that again. Anywhere that the knight would like to move forward is controlled by the bishop, okay? And so the knight really doesn't have a lot of options to move forward because that bishop could always just take it. The nice thing about the bishop, though, is it's a long-range piece, so you also get the bonus control over usually some extra squares. And so if you're going to put your bishop somewhere, a lot of times that's a good place to put it to control the opponent's knight. Okay, and we actually see another example of that after knight g6, attacking this guy. He goes back to g3, and it's the same idea. You're positioning your bishop where it's controlling all of the squares that the knight could go to, and you also get some bonus coverage on some other squares as well. All right, so this is the critical moment in the game where black actually played e5, but I do want to pause here and have you do a little test. If black would have played knight h5 instead, really trying to hunt down one of your bishops, what move could you have played here as white to kind of get into a nice position? If you had a chance to look at that, there's not a tactic per se here, but you could simply move your knight, attacking the queen. Well, actually, let me back up. The first thing you have to notice is you can't just take the knight or the queen is going to take you. And black succeeds in trading a knight for a bishop. But if you play knight b3, the queen has to go somewhere that continues to guard the knight. If you go somewhere else, you just lose your knight, right? So if you look carefully, you can't go here because the knight, can't go there because the knight, you can't go there because of the bishop, you can't go there because of the queen. It only leaves one square for the queen. You have to go to g5. But after you go to g5, you can now jump in with your other knight attacking it again. And remember, you still have to hang on to the knight, which means the queen has to go back to h6. And now you've forced the queen into a really awkward square. It's kind of stuck. The knights are awkward, and you can still actually save your bishop by just moving it away. In black's position, it's kind of a mess. Okay? So there's not a tactic. You're not winning material. You're not getting a checkmate. But you just have a really nice position. All right, and that's what I wanted to see if you noticed. All right, so that's what could have happened potentially if black decided to go knight h5. Instead, we go back to the game where they played the move e5. And like I mentioned at the start of the video, d5 and f5 now should jump out at you when you see this game is like, oh, okay, I can use these squares in the future for my pieces. And we're going to see exactly what that looks like. And actually, I do want to point out something here. Even though you give up the d5 and the f5 squares, this is not a terrible move for black. It does do a lot of things. Number one, it attacks the knight. Number two, it shuts down this bishop, so you're not having control over the board over here. Number three, it lets this guy out. It puts a pawn kind of in the center of the board where it's just kind of annoying. So it does a lot of things, but it comes at a cost. All right, so white does have to move the knight because it's being attacked by the pawn, so they go back to b3. The queen goes back to c7. And now white plays the move queen b1, which attacks the queen with the rook. Now, something really interesting has happened here that I want to point out over the last couple of moves. Going back to this position right here, notice what has happened. The bishop is under attack. white makes a retreating move. Bishop is under attack, white makes a retreating move. The other bishop is under attack, white makes a retreating move. Knight is under attack, white makes a retreating move. And then here again, you make a retreating move. So for 5 moves in a row, white has just gone backwards. But what you will notice is that just because they went backwards, they didn't create weaknesses in their position. They actually were positioning their pieces on good squares that limited their opponent's pieces, kind of like we talked about how the bishop was limiting the knight, things like that, right? And you end up with a really solid position. So moving backwards is not always a bad thing. As long as you're not creating weaknesses and you're dealing with the threats in a good way, that could be totally fine. Now, I have a test for you guys. Queen b1 is actually a very powerful move, but I want to see if you understand why. So if black were to play the move bishop to d7, what would you play here as white? Get a chance to look at that. Hopefully you noticed the discovered attack, which I kind of already mentioned. But knight to d5 is the best way to do that. You unleash the attack on the queen. And after the queen moves somewhere, you're going to jump into c7 with a fork on the rooks, and you're just going to win some material. Okay, so very powerful threat, actually, which was set up by the move queen to b1. So black decides to play the move queen to b8 to get away from the rook. And you might think, okay, both sides just did the same thing. They both moved, their queen to the b file. Pretty equal as far as the last 2 moves. Actually, no. This is a key point. Okay, make sure you pay attention to this. This move was much better for white than this move was for black. Why? Because the rook that's in the corner does not exist over here for white. Okay, one of the bad things about having a piece like this, if a rook is in the corner, is that it's stuck. It can't come to the center of the board. But white has already done that. White's rooks are already positioned on the open files in the center of the board, doing exactly what they should be doing. Black's rook has not done that. So going queen to b8 for black is a much more awkward and bad move because now your rook is stuck out of the game. Okay, same thing can be said about this bishop. One of the worst things about the bishop is that it's blocking this rook. Okay, if your bishop was out, your rook came to the center, and then your bishop had to go back for some reason, that's not the end of the world. The key thing is that you remember your rooks need to be towards the center on the open files. Now, of course, if there's an open file on the A file, well, that's a different story. Then maybe the rook is good there, right? Open file. But in this case, this is where the rooks need to be. All right, so white plays the move bishop f3, further positioning the bishop on a good diagonal, putting pressure here, stopping this pawn from moving forward. Black plays queen a7, and right here, I'd like you to pause and think about what move you might play in this position. All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move that was played was knight to a5, and at first glance, that might seem like, how would I have come up with a move like knight a5? Well, it's actually really simple when you think about it. You want to think in terms of, okay, what is my opponent most likely to do to get out of their bad position? So when somebody has a bad position, you want to think about, like, okay, there's a couple of things they might be able to try, A, B, C, or whatever, and think about what the most likely thing is. Well, for black, they need to get that rook into the game. We already talked about it, right? So developing this bishop somewhere and then bringing their rook over is extremely likely that's what they would like to do. So if you know that and you think about that and you play the move knight a5, guess what? If they now try to move their bishop out, I'm just going to grab this pawn. So knight a5 was simply a preventative move trying to stop black from getting their pieces developed. That's it. Just stopping. It's not really threatening anything at the moment. It's just preventing them from developing. Okay, very, very powerful move. And I think a lot of people would miss this idea. Okay, the other thing, if they try to play something, for example, like rook b8 and then push this pawn, you're going to walk into knight c6 and get forked. So it also kind of prevents that plan as well. Okay, so let's go back to the game. So black plays bishop to b4, trying to get rid of the pesky knight, which is stopping them from continuing their development. And of course, it is undefended, so white decides to move it, but now puts more pressure on the center. Bishop to d7 is now played because you no longer have to worry about, the knight taking your pawn. And this is a good moment to pause. And what move would you play in this position? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, finally now we start to see the d5 square. And white jumps in and, going back to earlier when they pushed this pawn forward, right? We're now several moves ahead. We start to see the significance of that. So knight to d5 actually threatens all sorts of things if you look carefully. You're threatening to take the bishop. That's one. You're threatening to go here with the fork on the rooks. That's another. You're also threatening to simply just take the knight with check, and then after the recapture, you'll grab a free bishop on d7. So you have so many threats here. Very difficult for black to deal with everything, and so they have to take your knight. So what does white do? Well, bishop takes d5, replaces that piece with another one, and guess what? There's a new threat. You're going to take here with check, and after the king takes, the rook is going to jump down. Okay, discovered attack. So again, we see this d5 square being used by white's pieces. So black plays bishop e6, and this is kind of another good moment, I think, to pause. What would you play here? If you had a chance to look at that, hopefully you didn't say just to trade. Because when you have a good position, especially when you're controlling a critical square on the board, usually trading your piece away is going to be the wrong decision. And the reason is after black recaptures is you kind of just freed up the position. They don't really have any problems. They're like, what are you going to do now? I don't really know, right? So what does white do instead? Queen to e4. Rather than trading, you're getting ready to replace that with another piece. Oh, and at the same time, you're actually activating your queen, attacking a bunch of stuff at the same time. Okay, but try to remember this. Generally speaking, you don't want to trade if you can just support with another piece, unless there is a very specific reason. Like, for example, when you trade that piece, it allows you to follow up with a tactic or something like that. Otherwise, try not to trade. All right, so black decides to go ahead and trade. White recaptures with the rook, and it's funny because the knight landed there, then the bishop landed there, and now the rook is landing there, right? So you're seeing how all these different pieces are landing on the d5 square. Rook a to c8, and now we actually have a really interesting moment in the position, okay? And if you read the book, he talks about this e5 pawn. And because if you look carefully, there's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, there's 4 pieces attacking it, only 2 pieces defending it. So it kind of looks like, well, can't I just get a free pawn, right? Well, there's a couple of problems with this, and we need to talk about this. So let's go ahead just one by one. First of all, if you take with the knight, you're not paying attention to the pin on your rook, and you simply get checkmated on the back rank. That would be a horrible mistake to lose the game. But let's just say you ignore the knight for a second, and you focus on these 3 pieces. You still have 3 pieces attacking and only 2 defending. So why can't you just take maybe with the bishop? And he mentions a line in the book. And I actually happened to check that line with Stockfish as I was going through this game, and the line is wrong, okay? Now, remember, this book was written before we had Stockfish like we do now. So no fault of the author. He was probably just analyzing and thought it was a valid line. But check this out. He mentions the line f6. He says, black's going to play f6 here, and you're going to be in trouble. And this is the line that he mentions. He says, after f6, you could play bishop d4 to try to counterattack the queen, but black would simply take, and when you take the queen, he's going to take over here. You lose a piece, and that's a bad line. Here is what the author overlooked. After f6, instead of this bishop d4 move, and you do have to do something because you're about to like lose a piece, right? But instead of this bishop d4 move, Stockfish finds an absolutely ridiculous move. If you want to pause, go ahead and pause. I don't think anybody watching this video is going to find this move. I would be amazed if you find it. Please let me know. But go ahead and pause the video. All right, and the move that Stockfish says, and it's the only move that's good for white, is rook d back to d1. This is like the most absurd looking move because you have a problem here, and what are you going to do? You're going to take one of the defenders and you're going to move it all the way back to the first rank. What? The idea, there's two ideas, I think. Number one is you're clearing the square for your queen, okay? That's why you're doing that. And number two, you're defending your rook here actually so that this is not going to be like a checkmate if you had to move your knight. So there's kind of like 2 parts to that move. But let me show you what this line looks like. It's actually fascinating. So black takes your bishop. You go with the check, queen to d5. The king has to run, actually the best move for black is king f8, in which case it's going to be like a draw, supposedly, like some sort of perpetual check draw is what the engine says. But if they go to h8, watch this. This is where it really gets wild. King h8, you're going to play an incredible move. If you want to pause again, go ahead, but don't feel bad if you don't see it. It's quite complicated. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is knight takes e5. And now you see that you needed this guy to defend here, so you're not just checkmated. That's one thing. But you're actually setting up the smothered checkmate. The smothered checkmate in chess is one of the coolest checkmates that you will ever see. Okay, so let me actually show you if you've never seen it. Let's say black takes your rook, trying to put pressure here. If you want to pause, go ahead. I gave you a big clue with smothered checkmate. If you had a chance to look at that, knight to f7 check forces the king here. Knight to h6. This is the common smothered checkmate pattern. It's a double check, which means your king has to move. You can't take the knight because the queen would still be putting you in check. If you move here, that's just checkmate. So you have to go back in the corner. And now that you've got the knight positioned on h6, you can do the famous smothered checkmate finish. Queen g8, the king cannot take because the knight is defending. That's important. Rook has to take, and look what we've done. We've surrounded the king by their own pieces, smothered checkmate on f7. Absolutely incredible. You know what's so amazing about this to me is like, from this position right here, like I would have never been thinking that smothered checkmate would even be an option. Like it just doesn't even look like the pieces are even close to a smothered checkmate, right? And yet that's exactly, nope, not that line, sorry. That's exactly what Stockfish says. Rook comes back, queen comes in, and then you have a smothered checkmate. I mean, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing, right? Now, there's more to this position because black doesn't have to take your rook. Okay, we saw if they take, then you're going to go knight f7 and get the smothered checkmate. Cool. But what if they just take your knight? Because that's the other part of the puzzle. Like, wait a second, can I just not do this? Well, actually, no, because rook takes c8. You're attacking here. You just lost a rook if you're black, so you kind of have to recapture, except you can't recapture because if you do, guess what? Queen to d8, check. If you take me, you're getting checkmated. You don't have to take. You can actually survive if you play bishop f8, but it's just a terrible position because you basically lost a bunch of pieces and you're still in a bad position. Wow. And then, of course, if you take with the rook, that just doesn't help you at all. This guy's coming down with check. And so it's just a good position for white, okay? Which is why, going back to this position, the best move for black was king f8 and just taking the perpetual check back and forth. Now, let me just summarize what we just talked about, because I know that was a lot. So let me just remind you how we got here, okay? Going back to the game, the rook recaptured. After rook a to c8, the author mentioned that you can't take the pawn with your bishop because of f6. But that's not correct, and I just showed you why, because there's this amazing Stockfish move that nobody would ever find in the game, but it's there, bringing your rook back and setting up all the stuff, okay? So, the actual way that black can win, by the way, this is the other important thing, this is a bad move, but it's not because of f6. It's a bad move because of b5. And notice what's happening on b5. The knight's under attack, but if you move the knight, checkmate. Okay? So, or it's going to lead to checkmate. The rook can block, but it doesn't help you, okay? So this is why it's a bad position for white. You're pinned here. You're pinned here. Your knight is under attack. You just don't have any good follow-up moves in this position, and you're going to lose a piece, right? So it was good that white did not take the pawn, but not for the reason that the author mentioned. I thought that was fascinating. The smothered checkmate popped up out of nowhere as I was analyzing. I was like, wow, that's so cool. So I wanted to share that with you guys. I hope you enjoyed that one. And let's jump back to the game, okay? So in the game, this move was played. White avoided the capture and instead played rook c to d1, doubling up on the d file and getting out of the pin, which looks like a very natural and logical move. So in the game, black played the move bishop to f8. But I want to pause here and ask you the question, what if they played f5, trying to lure your queen away from the defense of the knight? What would you play? If you had a chance to look at that, of course, you could play a move like queen d3. That's not terrible, but actually taking the pawn is the best move. Sacrificing the knight because of the follow-up rook to d8 or rook to d7, both moves actually win for you. Let's just go rook to d8. You're threatening to simply take. Of course, if they take you, this is awful. It's not an immediate checkmate, but after queen e6, I do believe there is some, yeah, you just take the rook. It's basically a fork. And so that's what happens there. Your knight is actually tactically defended, basically because as soon as you move the rook and create these other threats, you're going to have this fork one way or another where you're going to pick up the rook or you're going to get checkmate instead. Okay, hope that made sense. So f5, you do have the tactics. All right, so black doesn't do that. They played bishop to f8. All right, so b3 is played, adding support to the knight. Black plays b5, attacking your knight. Now I'm going to give you guys two options, and I want you to tell me which one is the best move and which one is a mistake. Think carefully, okay? Your options are number one, knight to d6, and number two, knight takes e5. I'm not going to say anything else except that one of those moves is good, one of those moves is bad. Which one do you think is the good move? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the good move and the move that was played in the game is knight to d6. And the reason that knight takes e5 is bad is because you are walking into a pin. Usually that's not a good thing to do unless you have some sort of crazy tactic, but in this case you don't. Black's just going to play f6, attacks your knight. You can't really move it because you lose your queen, and that's all there is to. Actually, there is this move knight c6, which looks interesting because you're attacking here, but black will play the move queen a8, and they'll keep the attack. There's a double attack on your knight and your queen, and you're just going to be in trouble, okay? But knight takes e5 is losing. The best move in what was played in the game, knight to d6, okay? And it's a fork, But of course, there's the bishop there, which means it's actually just going to lead, excuse me, it's actually just going to lead to a trade, all right, which is fine because white is saying, look, even if we trade, which I believe is what happened in the game, yes, it was, he still has total control over the d file. He's got pressure here, and he also has the threat of invading on the 7th rank, which is very, very dangerous, and black's going to be on the defensive because of that. All right, so black plays rook c7 just to deal with the threat that I just mentioned, rook to d7. And this is a really, really good moment in the game where it's kind of like, okay, what do you do now? And I like the way that the author, Irving Chernev, does this in some of these positions. He actually gives you a little snippet of like, this is probably what this person was thinking about, something along these lines to come up with the move they were going to play. So what I want you guys to do is actually pause the video, think about what you would play in this position, and then I'm going to read the logic that he writes in the book. I'm actually just going to read it word for word from the book. This is on page 251 and 252. And to get an idea of what Rubinstein was probably thinking, okay? So he says, let us listen in on what Rubinstein might say to himself in reasoning out a course of action. Okay, here we go. My rooks are well placed as they can be doing. My rooks are as well placed as they can be, doing a good job on controlling the open D file. Yes, I see that. I would agree with that. My queen is strongly centralized and exerts pressure in every direction. Again, I would agree with that. Yes, makes a lot of sense. My bishop bears down on his e-pawn and keeps a rook and a knight chained to its defense. Again, we can see that, okay? My pieces are all usefully occupied and must stay where they are. Okay, so he's saying I don't really want to move these pieces because they're in good places. How about my opponent? His defense just about holds together, but his pieces must stay where they are to guard his weak points. If I leave him alone, he might consolidate his forces and even counterattack. If I leave him alone, say, isn't that the key to the position? I must not leave him alone. Okay, so he kind of gets to an idea in his head of like, okay, I need to do something. I must interfere with the arrangement of his pieces. I must drive them off from their present positions. In fact, I might ruin his game by driving off even one defender. Okay, even one defender. Since my pieces are all useful where they are, I must not disturb them, but look to my pawns to break up the defense. Okay, so this is kind of the next critical moment in his thought process. He's realizing I can't use these pieces, I have to use a pawn. Which pawn shall I use and which of his pieces shall I try to dislodge? The first thing to do is find the target. His queen and rooks are too far away and agile to be bothered. Okay? To be bothered by pawns. Any of them can move off to a different square on a file or on a rank and still control it. I must aim at a fixed target, some piece that is needed at the spot where it is stationed and loses its effectiveness as soon as it is displaced. How about the knight? Suppose I played h4 and gave it a nudge by h5. Okay, now he's coming up with an idea. It would have to leave its fine defensive position immediately. Where could it go? If to e7, it blocks the activation of the e-rook. If it retreats to the back rank, it's out of play for a time. Besides, I get another benefit in moving the h-pawn. It gives my king a flight square so that it doesn't fall into a surprise mate on the first rank. Remember earlier we were looking at all these positions where the rook was coming down and it was checkmate. He's talking about that. So that was what he said. All right, that was what he was, pretending like, okay, this is probably what Rubinstein was thinking about. And so what did he play? He played h4. And it makes a lot of sense. He wants to drive the knight away, and we had just talked about it. He now doesn't have to worry about back rank checkmates. Fantastic move. Okay, f6 is played to try to add support to the pawn. And now, if you want to pause, what do you think he did next? Well, this one makes a lot of sense. If you look at the last move the black played, he created weaknesses where? Along this diagonal. So what does he do? Queen jumps into d5 check to take advantage of that. Now, remember that d5 square? The knight initially invaded for that was on c3. Remember that? Then the bishop came. Then the rook came. And now the queen is coming. So all of the pieces have used that one square to really cause all these problems to black. And it just goes to show, like, every time you move a pawn, you create weaknesses. Now, of course, you can't play chess without moving pawns. You have to move them. But you always want to think about the ramifications of that. So black plays the move king h8. He follows through with his plan of driving the knight back. The knight goes back to f8. I'll just show you quickly. If it would have went to e7, there's a nice move here. Queen f7 just jumps into black's position, and you're actually threatening all kinds of things, starting with the rook. Let's just say that the rook move somewhere. Now you could play h6. Black doesn't want to take because it opens up here. This is going to lead to a quick checkmate. There's, I guess, rook d8, bishop b5 is also good, and Black's position is just done for. After here, you can just take, king takes, and then there's the checkmate. If you're wondering, just an example of what might have happened if Black would have played knight e7. All right, going back to the game, they played knight f8, and if you want to pause, you can pause. Yes. Yeah, if you want to pause, you can pause. What's the move here? If you get a chance to look at that, the move is h6. Okay, this is a really good idea. A lot of times when you have a pawn that you can push forward, even if your opponent is able to take it, a lot of times that's not going to be good for them because, number one, it totally messes up their pawn structure. But number two, a lot of times it creates other weaknesses, like we can see here on f6. And also we can see that the king is more open, right? And so if this would have happened, simply just taking on f6, followed by like bishop takes e5, for example, could lead to a really nice checkmate. Rook takes f8. Look at this. Double check, checkmate. And whenever you have double check, the king has to move to get away from it, except you can't move here because the bishop. You can't move here because the rook. And so that's just game over. So just an example of what could have happened if Black decided to take the pawn. All right, so instead of that, Black plays the move knight to g6. And here is a good moment to pause. This is not an easy move to find, but what do you think White played in this position? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is queen to e6, which is kind of wild because, wait a second, there's a rook there. First of all, if the rook takes you, guess what? The back rank is now open. Rook to d8 is going to lead to a quick checkmate after Black sacrifices all his pieces. So they can't take your queen. And he points out something really interesting here in that the queen is actually helping White to attack Black on all three ranks, okay? The 8th, the 7th, and the 6th rank. So how is that happening? Well, here you're threatening the 8th rank by just taking the rook. And we also saw if they take you, how you can invade on there. You're also threatening to play something like rook d7 and then take here with checkmate. Okay, so like once your rook is on d7, it blocks off these guys from defending, and the pawn capture is actually just checkmate. So that's a threat along the 7th rank. And then if Black takes you, you're also threatening things like queen takes f6, which is just going to totally open up the king and lead to an easy win from there. So queen e6. Let me see what was played in the game. I think Black decided to go rook f8, and then rook d7 was played, like we talked about, threatening checkmate right here. So Black had to take now. And then the bishop went to h4, coming in here. And yeah, Black actually just resigned. Okay. For example, if they take, can you find the win for White from this position? There's a chance to look at that. It's simply queen e7. The knight was guarding e7. And as soon as you went away to get the bishop, it allowed these pieces to line up. There's a checkmate here, there's a checkmate here, there's a checkmate here. Okay, there's multiple threats. Of course, taking the rook doesn't do anything because White just replaces it, and it's over. Even if you try to sack your queen, you would still get checkmated on f8, so it's just game over. Black resigned. Now, one thing that he points out here, which I think was really, really valuable, is he says that, you know, if you like to look for sacrifices and nice moves like this, he points out that you always have to do it from a position of an advantage. Like, you can't not develop your pieces and not control the center and not make your opponents create any weaknesses and then just all of a sudden expect that you can just sack your queen for a brilliant checkmate, right? It's usually not going to work that way. So it's important that you learn these principles, you understand these ideas, you get into a good, solid position like White has here, and then, bam, that's when the brilliant moves start coming out of nowhere. Okay, but that's really, really important that you understand that. Guys, this was the last game. I hope you enjoyed that. I know I certainly did. Don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere because we're going to look at the books that we're going to do next. But I just want to say, Logical Chess Move by Move by Irving Chernoff, fantastic book. There's a link in the description. I know a lot of you have already ordered it and have been going through it with us. Feel free to pick it up if you haven't and you want to go through it on your own. Highly recommend it, or you can just watch the videos. We've covered all the games. Totally up to you. Thank you guys, and now let's talk about the survey. I actually, on the last video, posted a survey, which I'll throw up on the screen for you guys. Almost 400 people have, actually, maybe I can just bring it right over here and you'll be able to see it. Yeah, almost 400 people have responded. These are the ratings, okay? So pretty actually nice range of ratings there. And then I will show you this. Let me do it like this so you can see it better. This was the result. These are the results, okay? So we have in the lead 100 endgames you must know, and then a close second is Silman's complete endgame course, and then quite a few people were saying how to reassess your chess, okay? I was also looking at the comments on YouTube, and it also came down to these two endgame books, okay? So I have them right over here. And actually, you know what I'm gonna do for this? I'm gonna actually go to full screen so you can see me maybe a little bit better. So I have both of these books right here, okay? There you go. When I saw that you guys were voting for these two books, I actually looked into them in more detail, and I discovered something interesting about 100 Endgames that you must know. I thought that this was more of like an intermediate book, okay? That's why I put 1200 plus on the recommended rating there. That's what I thought it was. But as I was reading more about it and kind of looking into it, it's actually a more advanced Endgame book. Like it's more geared toward like 2000 plus rated players in a lot of cases. So what I have decided that we're going to do, and I think this is going to be for the best interest of all the viewers, we're going to go through Silman's complete endgame course. I know it didn't win, but we're going to go through this. And what I'm going to do is on the side, I'm going to go through this myself. And if I find any endgames in here that I think are like, you know what, this was actually really interesting, I think my audience would appreciate that, I'm going to throw those into our endgame lessons as well. Okay, so if I'm like, oh, endgame number 7 was really cool, let me just take a break from Silman's endgame course and do this. I'm not going to go back and forth. I'm going to go through this book, but I am going to include supplemental stuff from this one, if that makes sense. Okay, I think that's the best decision that's going to benefit the most people. I think I kind of misled people. The title of this book is very catchy, and I think led people to believe that it was a bit more beginner friendly, intermediate friendly, and really that's not quite the case. Now, of course, we can still go through it, but anyway, that's what I'm going to do. So Silman's endgame course is coming next. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. Feel free if you want. You could buy both books. You could buy none of the books. You could buy one book. Totally up to you. But yeah, that's what we're going to do. So leave questions, leave comments. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next week with the first endgame lesson. This is going to be super helpful, guys, because endgames are not talked about enough, and I see so many players struggle in the endgames. I think this is going to really, really improve your just overall play. Okay, even some of the decisions that you make in the middle game are going to be affected by the endgame knowledge that you have in a good way, right? Because if you know, like, oh, this position that I can trade and end up in, it's going to be a win because I've studied it. Well, it just helps your middle game decision-making process. So thank you, guys. I appreciate everybody for following along with the series and giving me the feedback, and I'm excited to dive into some endgame stuff. So thank you guys, and I will see you next time. As always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.